Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Byron Clue with Corteva AgriScience. I am the moderator for this afternoon's activities, and I'm really happy that you've been able to join us here. We've got a great lineup of speakers. This is not their first rodeo. They've been on a show before together, if you will, and so it's awesome to have this group of speakers in this session this afternoon. Things off and lay the groundwork for where the rest of the afternoon will go and why this is an important topic. We have with us this afternoon Dr. Morgan Treadwell from Texas A&M University, who will speak on the topic of Beyond the Boom, integrated approaches to managing weeds and brush. And my able assistant over here, Sarah Williams, she's our timekeeper and the keeper of all things. When she stands, there's 5 minutes to go. And if I stand, there's 0 minutes to go.
Game over, in other words. Thank you, Byron, and thank you for getting the band back together. This is always a really fun treat for me just because I learn something every time from every single one of these folks that are getting ready to speak. So thank you for being here, and please let me know if you have any questions. I am going to try to jumpstart the conversation as much as I can, but everyone after me is definitely an expert, so save all the hard questions for them, please. So in my neck of the woods in Texas, if you're not talking about brush, then you're somewhat irrelevant. We've been fighting brush for generations, for centuries. And probably the most recent example, one of the most well-documented examples of how early stewards and ranchers and producers started to notice a change on the landscape was in the Timber of the Edwards Plateau of Texas report. And this was published in 1904. And what really jumps out to me is the fundamental change that they not only noticed, but they documented on the rangeland, semi-arid rangeland landscapes of West Texas. And so I'm talking probably 15 to 22 inches of average annual rainfall each year. But in 1904, a man by the name of William Bray documented this change, and he said it is of fundamental importance to note that the type of vegetation in this region is undergoing a change. This change, broadly indicated, consists in a transition from grasses to woody growth. And it's very apparent even to the casual observer. Now, mostly Mr. Bray talks about honey mesquite, and he said that the mesquite captures open pastures, and many have watched the scrub oak timber occupy lands that formerly were open prairies. This is in 1904. Now, he also mentioned that the spread of mesquite was by no means the least striking phenomenon in this campaign of encroachment of timber upon prairie land that has been spreading of mesquite over the cattle country. So even at the turn of the century, we were already losing grazable acres, productive rangeland to mesquite and to brush. And not only did Mr. Bray write about it, but they also showed pictures. And these pictures, to me, I look at this photograph published in 1904 in this Department of Ag publication, and I look at that and I think, my goodness, that could be present day. 1904 to 2023, and what have we learned? What have we changed? What have we done differently as producers, as ranchers, as land managers, as land stewards? Why are we not understanding that what we are currently doing isn't working? And so many times I feel like it's like a bad breakup, right? Where you just want to look at that country and just say, this just isn't working out. I don't know what we're doing wrong, but what we're doing is not working. But how do we relay that? How do we communicate that? And how do we get land managers and ranchers to start thinking about doing things differently in a more efficient and more effective manner? We know that what we are not doing is from reading experiences from like what Mr. Bray documented in 1904. We can also look out our window as we're driving across West Texas and see the sheer amount of brush that is eating up every single open working landscape acre. Or we can use new tools and technologies like the Rangeland Analysis Platform, or RAP for short. Dr. Jack Twidwell out of the University of Nebraska and his colleagues, Brady Allred from University of Montana, have developed this really insightful tool, and what I value most about it is it goes all the way back to 1984. So sure, we can go back to 1904 through resources like what Mr. Bray wrote about, but we can also look at the spread of woody brush species across not only Texas, but across the Great Plains, all the way back to the early 90s. So this is the Rangeland Analysis Platform assessment of woody transitions occurring in a little town in West Texas called El Dorado, Texas. Now the yellow spots that you see are highlights that this program is picking up as sensitivity to woody brush species, meaning these species are coming out of the draws or coming off the hilltops, and they're encroaching on open landscapes and open acres. Through the toolbar on the wrap, you can see how this transition is progressing both temporally and spatially. Fast forward to 2000, those yellow areas are starting to grow like a cancer almost. They're taking over those open spaces and actively invading grassland sites in a very fragile and shallow soil environment that is West Texas. Keep going to 2020, and we're seeing almost closed canopy of open spaces. And this represents so much more than just plant community shifts and transitions and vegetation changes. This represents the breakdown of ranching livelihoods and those people that are depending upon our herbaceous plant communities to essentially feed their families and to sustain that ranching lifestyle and tradition for generations to come. Now, I mentioned that this is not just a Texas problem, but we can see this across the entire Great Plains as well. So through the wrap, we can zoom out, and this is looking at most of the southern Great Plains from Texas into Oklahoma. Again, going back to 1990, 2000, and 2020. What are we doing? What are we doing with every single dollar of equip money? What are we doing with every single piece of research and science? And why are our practices not integrated into our principles? Where are we getting it wrong, and what can we do differently? I'm going to share with you a little bit later on about a really cool project called the Prairie Project, and it's a group of researchers teamed up from Oklahoma State University, University of Nebraska, and Texas A&M, where we are all fighting the same problem that is woody brush encroachment, but we're starting to do it from an integrated approach of collaboration. The brush, the juniper that I'm finding in Texas is no different than the species that are being fought in Oklahoma, Nebraska, Kansas, even South Dakota and North Dakota. Again, if we look at the wrap, we can see how widespread this problem is, and we can also realize what little is being done about it. Going back to 1990, 2000, and 2020. Now, granted, this is a very broad-scale assessment of what this species and what the brush is doing across the Great Plains corridor, but I would encourage you, as you look at this map, to think about our grasslands that are remaining. How long will they be remaining? In Texas, it's said that you can lose a ranch to brush in 30 years. I think it's quicker than that. I think it's a much shorter time frame. And it scares me because when I look at my daughter and I want to see her doing the same things that my husband and I are doing, I'm wondering how much of a challenge and a fight is she going to have in order to hold on to a ranch and to also make a living doing it. All of us in this room understand the importance of grasslands, and we're all here for that very same reason. And we're probably all genuinely concerned about the fragility of those systems. And we all know the importance of them. Ecosystem services, human health, all of that above is very important. But sometimes I think we forget about this guy. We forget about the many, many ranchers and producers that are tasked with making a living off of grasslands and our rangelands, our working landscapes. And what are we doing to make sure that guys like him get to stay in business and get to enjoy those open spaces, not only in his generation, for generations to come? We start talking about maintaining grazable acres and open spaces, but to me, it's so much more than that. Our ranchers, our producers need to be able to find and gather livestock. You can't do that in brushed out country. If you can't walk through it or ride a horse through it, you definitely can't ride a UTV or ATV through it. and the ability to manage livestock as a livelihood becomes that much more less successful. In West Texas, we deal with predators left and right. We're sheep and goat country. And sheep and goats, well, they may be a headache, but they're also major producers of agriculture in that area. If we can't maintain them through the ability to safely maintain predators in those open spaces, then again, what are we doing? Livestock performance, you're going to hear from all of these experts that body condition score, the ability for a cow to produce a calf every season, and overall heifer development through improved genetics from ranches like this one are key. But also, I want us all to keep in mind, too, that the overall productivity, the short term of that ranch, is just as important as the long-term sustainability of that ranch. And we need to keep that in mind as we have increased fragmentation, urbanization, and a changing landowner demographic that quite simply doesn't understand how important it is to manage weeds and brush. You talk to kids outside of Austin, Texas, and they're going to say that they live in a forest. They have no idea that that was a grassland 100 years ago, 75 years ago. They have no idea the type of ecosystem services that are dependent upon those types of plant communities. And what that means in not only from a ranching perspective, but the ability to mitigate wildfires in an ever-changing climate. Dr. Joe Veldman, a colleague of mine from Texas A&M, once said that if you take fire out of the grasslands, it's like taking rain out of the rainforest. And that is one probably important part of the system that we have not successfully integrated into the fullest capacity that we probably should. You look at the production of the Great Plains, you should also realize that the fire frequency signature throughout the Great Plains from north to south was huge and was as frequent as every 2 years or so. You take a look at Texas alone, and again, that fire frequency or fire return interval varied from less than 2 years every other year to probably every 10 years or so, depending on the precipitation regime and drought cycle that we are in. We have done a really good job managing grazing, probably not so much of a good job managing brush. And the one area where I can say that we have probably not been as successful in that integrated approach is managing for fire, both planned and for wildfire. So think about how much more successful we would be in managing grasslands and keeping open space open if we started to integrate the very process that these grasslands evolved with. Why are we taking a process out of these fire-dependent and fire-tolerable systems? Think what it could be if we shifted that competitive advantage to the species that needed the fire the most and shifted it away from the brush. So I'd like to share with you some promising approaches that I've seen from landowners and ranchers in Texas. And they deal with grazing, they deal with fires, and they deal with drought. This one example is from a ranch in Cristobal, Texas, that's south of San Angelo. Probably right around 20 inches of average annual rainfall, so think of semi-arid rangeland landscapes. This particular rancher understood how quickly brush was taking over his landscapes, and he wanted to do something about it, but he didn't know the right process, the right tool, and so he just got started. And when he got started, he implemented a growing season prescribed fire, and that was in 1990. He worked with his local prescribed burn association. He depended on a Texas A&M AgriLife researcher named Dr. Charles Butch Taylor, and they performed a very successful fire on 1,000 acres of his operation. Now, fast forward 20 years or so, 20 or 30 years, he realized that he needed to do something again, and that just because he implemented one fire, that did not suppress the brush or keep the brush out of his pasture. It was a maintenance that he needed to be on and a maintained schedule. And so he started to defer his grazing in 2018, and he executed an aerial herbicide application targeting honey mesquite in 2020. Now, he had really decent, strong rainfall leading up to that, and he was banking his grass enough to where he could successfully implement a prescribed fire following that herbicide application. He had a really good kill on his honey mesquite. As you can see in the picture, probably anywhere from 90 to 95% kill using Sendero. And then after that, he is planning another growing season prescribed fire to clean it up. Now, did he solve all of his brush problems? No. He's going to have to stick with this routine. And this is a long-term commitment. But did he keep his open spaces open? Yes. Is he able to stay in the livestock business? Yes. Is he able to maintain his native plant community with desirable grasses? Yes. So, in the short-term battle, this producer out of Cristobal, Texas, is winning that particular war on brush. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know why that looks different. This is another particular example, again, kind of in that San Angelo, West Texas area. But this is a promising approach where the landowner knew that drought was a frequent cycle. And again, this particular landowner integrated an aerial herbicide application and a summer growing season prescribed fire. What this particular landowner realized, though, that he was, we should have clicked through those slides, shouldn't we? What this particular landowner was able to distinguish is that he changed and altered his above ground plant community because he prioritized the below ground soil nutrient response that he got from introducing fire and herbicide into his plant communities. This particular integrated approach made him survive the drought that he went through in 2021 and 2022. On those recently burned areas that were also treated with Sendero on his honey mesquite, he increased his grass production by about 500 pounds per acre. That saved his livestock. He did not have to dissolve anything during the drought, and he was able to hold on to most of his livestock when everybody around him was selling off, just because he managed his brush and he took care of the landscape with an evolutionary process that these plant communities evolved with. He got a lot of other extra benefits out of it too, like increased plant diversity, increased soil fertility, and all of the white-tailed deer and other wildlife species congregated to those recently burned areas because that was the only place where there was green grass. There's another promising approach, managing weesatch in South Texas. And if any of you know Benny Martinez, he can definitely speak to this. They're managing for a three-way mix on some South Texas rangelands where it's spraying an entire block or pasture followed up with a spray one, skip one application. What this does is stretches the ranch brush management dollar more effectively. They can spray more acres and they can treat more land, which in turn opens up more grass while they're spraying more acres. This is the weesatch that was sprayed in 2020, followed by 2021 in the middle and 2022 on the far side. Again, stretching that brush management dollar more to maintain the livestock production business and maintain the overall stewardship and productivity of those landscapes. I did mention the Prairie Project. The Prairie Project is looking at prescribed fire, patch burn grazing, pyrrhic herbivory across the entire Great Plains to keep our open spaces open and to focus on an integrated approach that is beneficial for our ranchers and our producers, and really emphasizing the role that our landowners play in managing these working landscapes. We've got to complete the cycle in delivering the very best of science to our landowners and our producers. That's our job. That's why we're here. And if anything, we can tell them that becoming more focused on a proactive response versus a reactive response in managing brush and keeping our open lands open is going to be advantageous for everybody who is dependent upon grasslands. It's not just the ranchers, but it's everybody. These pockets of grasslands need to be protected, they need to be fought for, and it needs to be an integrated approach where there is an investment in it every year. It needs to be a priority for all of those who are looking to maintain open spaces and working landscapes. So with that, thank you so much for your time. I'm sorry if I went over. I don't know if I have any time for questions.
Thank you very much. We have time for a quick question for Morgan.
Why is mesquite a problem now when it wasn't before? What's changed about the soils or the environment that mesquite now comes in?
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
Sort of.
Okay, the question is why is mesquite a problem now? I would ask you to define now. So we know that William Bray in 1904 documented that change. So mesquite was even a problem then. But I think now it's becoming an even more alarming issue because what we're doing isn't working. And so the ability of mesquite to take over a open grassland is happening within a couple of years. And I think we're losing that connection to the landscape, that mesquite isn't supposed to occupy those areas. So people are forgetting what grasslands look like.
Thank you very much, Morgan.
Okay.
I'm afraid we'll have to move on. We'll probably have some time towards the end as well for a few questions. And we're going to make the switch here to our second presenter. Dr. Mark Renz from the University of Wisconsin will speak to us about realizing the value of managing weeds and brush in conservation grasslands. Mark?
Great, thanks. I'm going to give essentially the same talk, but from a northern perspective in Wisconsin, and really with a focus towards conservation grasslands, and give some of the experiences that we deal with and some of the justification and what's going on in Wisconsin. Don't need to stand here and say the grasslands are threatened. Anyone that saw one of the plenary speakers this morning emphasized it, saying they're under management and they're under more threat than any of our other systems that we see here. I just have some information, and I think there is a clear call for increase in conservation of this system. These conservation grasslands, at least in the United States, and I believe this is in other countries, there is some of that support and effort that is being done not from the federal governments or state governments, but a lot of it is local. And I tried to show some of those examples that is happening from nonprofits and others. We're working extensively with the Nature Conservancy, which clearly sees this threat and is doing a lot of our active management. And weeds, and I'm going to focus on brush in general, because in my experience, they're one of the biggest impacts, even up to our northern system, really threaten these grasslands. They can clearly threaten desirable plant abundance and diversity. I don't think I need to stand up here and document that, but we have dramatic impacts on wildlife habitat, changes in nutrient cycling and retention, increase in disturbance frequencies such as fire frequency, and altering hydrologies. And these are all well documented, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, but I want to kind of give you the story from our wildlife habitat perspective, because I think it's a really clean story, and we use this story when we talk to people who have recently purchased grasslands for conservation purposes, because they don't really think through this and how at such low densities the impact is. So come on a trip with me. I'm going to take you from Texas up to Wisconsin. Historically, about 30% of the state was in grasslands of some form. Currently, we have about half of that. 15% of it is in these working grasslands. As you can see with some of these colors are hard to see, but only less than 1% is in our conservation grasslands. And if you look really closely right here, there's there for our prairie chickens, and we have some for our upland bird species. But that's increasing every year. I wouldn't be surprised in my career if that number is closer to 3 or 4%, so pretty significant. Why are we so interested in these conservation grasslands in the Midwest? We're interested in protecting these obligate grassland bird species and their habitat. There's been tremendous effort. Many of you may or may not know that we've had dramatic losses in these obligate grassland bird habitat. 50% loss in 50 years of how frequently we see these, and 75% of these species are in decline. So they're not doing well. And here are some of the species in Wisconsin that we're specifically concerned with. I'm a plant geek, not a bird geek, so I can try to talk about some of these, but we have other people that we work with closely that really have done some great research to document this impact. I'm just going to share with you some of this because these are really good stories and scenarios you can share with others why we need to be proactive. And remember, Morgan emphasized that, being proactive. So some of my colleagues have documented the impact of these brush and shrub species on these grassland birds. And what they've essentially said is the presence of woody vegetation, even one solitary tree, is associated with lower occurrence and lower densities of these grassland birds. I don't need to show you any data to convince you that having more shrubs is going to reduce grassland cover, right? That's pretty obvious. But what we also found is it limits their use of that area and decreases their abundance. Here's some really neat data just to kind of highlight that the percentage of woodland species within a 500-meter radius of grasslands, even as little as 10%, can dramatically reduce how often we see these upland birds. And the primary reason for this, we believe, is due to it promotes the presence of these predators. Remember, these are ground nesting birds, and they have nests like this, and yes, there is a nest in there too. These predators, like skunks and other animals, if they have these woody areas for protection for them, they can then seek out these nests and essentially eliminate them. And this was documented really clearly, where they found in this neat study where they basically took paired grassland habitats. Half of them they removed all, and I emphasize all, woody species, and then they compared them to areas where they did not remove those species. And these were relatively low in these woody invasive cover. And they found when they removed that woody vegetation, within 2 years, they increased the occurrence of those grassland bird densities by 2 to 4-fold, just in 2 years. That's really impressive. And the nesting performance increased dramatically as well. And again, their linkage was they went and found and trapped for predators, and said those predators were almost eliminated from that system. So really, this became the platform of management for these obligate grassland birds, is to just remove as much woody vegetation as possible. So the good news is we've got lots of tools to manage those. We've been working with a range of animal species, and yes, I do work with goats. Sometimes I hate to admit that, but I do. There's lots of efforts with fire, and fire is a great tool, as Morgan mentioned. We look at integrated techniques, integrating mowing, herbicides, and different herbicides techniques, and they're effective. But I think there's two big things that I want to emphasize with the but. Management is species specific, and so we're going to choose different tools and different combinations of tools for different species. And that's been really hard to educate our conservation land managers, that they need to think before reaching for a management tool on what they have out in the landscape. And then the other more pressing issue is we have these large, dense populations that are established that they're trying to manage. I don't know who coined the phrase, but my graduate student uses it all the time, and I think it's really appropriate. In Wisconsin, we're trying to hold back a glacier like we did many centuries ago, but it's a green glacier of this brush species that we're dealing with, which is really, really a challenge. And I just want to give you an example from a local park that in the 60s bought land that was under production agriculture. They returned it to grassland. As you can see here, this is an aerial photo from the 70s. You can see there's a little bit of oak savanna over here, but all of this was productive grasslands. And right after this picture was taken in the 70s, for some reason, budget, something else, they said, why are we managing this grassland? And they stopped. So what happens when you don't manage a grassland for 40 years? This is what happens. It turns into a series of invasive shrub understory covered with really undesirable trees in the above ground area. And just to make sure you can see this, look at this road right here. And this is all grassland. Now there's that same road and that roundabout there, and that's what it looks like, just in 40 years for no management. I want to show you how dense and impenetrable this area looks. It's a sea. You literally can't walk through it, right? We have a high density of invasive bush honeysuckle and some buckthorn species. And then we have some of these really large bush honeysuckle shrubs, which is like a small Volkswagen Bug. I mean, they're massive. And there's nothing desirable underneath there. Guess what's underneath there? Garlic mustard, which is one of our top invasives too. So we run into these areas where it's going to take a generation to return this to this management. And so density is important, and we need to manage that. We can manage these shrubs. So if we get them when those populations are low, 230 shrubs per acre, we can do it relatively affordably. One of my colleagues in Indiana did this work. But when those density goes up to a modest density, we can triple that cost. Now, the density in those pictures that I shared was 2 times this density of 2,500, 2 to 3 times. It was 5,000 to 7,500 shrubs per acre. So you can just imagine the cost. We've done some other work in our conservation grazing in some of our natural areas, and these low cover in that 7 to 15 range, depending on the site. We were getting, again, similar costs for management. But when we get to those higher levels, we're easily doubling that. And again, this isn't the solid cover. This is just doubling that to 25 to 30% cover. So that can happen. So one of the approaches that we've dealt with our conservation land managers is really trying to hammer home this message of cost. Because a lot of times they're so busy they don't have time to think anything else. But when you say, like, if you manage it now, here's your cost. If you manage it later, this is your cost. So we've just been, as we've been doing various projects, documenting how expensive it is to manage these invasive shrubs. And here's just a summary per acre on several different areas and some of the densities. Japanese barberry is a new approaching invader. This density is right around that 24,000 plants or 2,400 plants per acre. Depending on the management, we're anywhere from $100 to $1,000 per acre. Buckthorn, higher density but smaller plants, $1,000 to $4,000 an acre. This was that bush honeysuckle site. Again, we can get up to $8,000 per acre in management. Extremely expensive. We're getting lots of questions on techniques that are not involving herbicides, such as forestry mowing or goats. So we've been doing a lot of work on that and estimating those costs. This is from 1 year of forestry mowing. Again, those shrubs will resprout, so it's just a one-time management like Morgan mentioned. And goat grazing has a lot of interest and a lot of benefits, but it's expensive. We're rotationally grazing. It's $5 per goat per day is what it costs us in that. It's a very clear cost. We're doing 2 rotational grazing intervals, getting not as effective control as forestry mowing and at a very expensive cost. But then what I show them is, after the bad news, I do it backwards. Bad news, then the good news. Here's the cost per shrub of doing some of these treatments. And you can see these costs per shrub are a lot more palatable, right? We're in cents per acre, a nickel per acre, up to 50 cents for foliar treatments. There's our basal bark treatment cost, stem injection, cut surface. We've even done some directed flame and give those costs. And the further good news that we have is that 80% of that cost is labor. And so this is why in the conservation world, we're relying heavily on volunteers for this support too. And that's been able to increase the management. So the take-home message of this is what? Density matters. Density matters for management. We really need to keep that density low. Well, density also matters in the biology and the invasion front of some of these invasives, and as well as ecosystem services, I'll mention. There's been some really great research showing that once we get to certain thresholds, these invasive woodies in particular exponentially increase how quickly they spread. And that threshold is low. We're talking thresholds somewhere in the cover of 5 to 10%. Very, very low is when we see this expansion. And then you can see how that increased invasion happens on a per year basis. So again, it's even more important to be proactive and get those populations while they're low. What's less known, and I'm going to talk about that, is these also have ecosystem service impacts, and we're less familiar where that threshold is, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. Well, first off, what are some of the ecosystem service for some of these invasive woody shrubs? It's very species specific. I want to emphasize that up front. But I just want to list some of these impacts that have been documented in the literature to give you an idea of the range. Restoring some of our beautiful native prairies is heavily impacted by invasive plants, limiting their establishment in these diverse prairies and having lots of impacts with pollinators especially. A lot of these in our grassland systems that have rivers that go through it, been well documented that having these invasive shrubs impacts the invertebrate populations that are in our rivers, causing reductions to some of our fish populations that we're managing for too. Lots of examples on impacts on hydrology, from annual grasses to tamarisk in the Southwest. And one of the things we don't think about a lot, but I think is more common than we think, is some of these impacts to our nutrient and our changing our nutrient systems too. We have several of these species are nitrogen-fixing species, so they're adding lots of nitrogen to these soil systems. And in the great example, I believe this was from Australia, that even when the black locust was removed, they found that nitrogen persisted even after they managed it for 14 years. So we have these legacy effects. And then lots of data on soil water retention. We're doing some more work on some of our species. We think that water percolation into the soil is heavily impacted by the presence of these two. So these are serious impacts that we can have. But I want to emphasize that the impacts of these weeds to these ecosystem services is very complex and dependent on a lot of factors. And I think a really area of growth that we're trying to get some more information on is we know spatial extent and density are two critical features for these impacts. And this is a great paper that was in our Invasive Plant Science and Management that talks about the challenges and prospects for measuring this. But the key point that I think our land managers are saying that, like, I know I have a problem. I know I need to treat these when these thresholds are low, when these plants are low, to be cost effective and to protect those ecosystem services. But I don't have the ability to do it all. I need more information on where these thresholds exist so I can better prioritize my management. And I think that's an area where we can really add value to this system. The good news is conservation grassland managers, and I think their concept and the way they think about managing conservation grasslands is changing. They want to use more tools. They want to do this. We're working with our state DNR. They're interested in introducing grazing as a management tool. So that's great. Has lots of perspectives in an integrated approach in controlling some of these invasive species. But it also brings some concerns. You know, one of the big concerns is they say, we just spent 20 years taking down all those fences. Now you're telling us you want us to put those fences back up? And so those are some of the real concerns, and dealing with toxic plants, which we're going to talk about as well too. So we're excited about the future. We think there's lots of hope, but it's going to be a lot more work in trying to be proactive. So just to kind of finish up and summarize, grasslands are clearly important, and I think conserving them is really important, and we have a new set of land managers that are really focused on conservation of our grasslands, and we need to tailor some of our outreach and extension programming to them, because weeds and brush can really impact them, and we need to really focus our efforts on identifying and telling them how these weeds, specifically the brush, are impacting their conservation goals, what species are, what the density is, and how spatial extent can influence that impact, and what are the management options, and what are the pluses and minuses, and how we can alleviate that. And like Morgan, proactive management is really the solution. We really need to think about this and how we can prevent some of that. This is like a first in my career. I think I actually finished ahead of time, so I'll show you some of our beautiful obligate grassland birds and some of the animals we use to manage those systems. And I'd love to answer some questions if there is time, which I think there is. Thank you.
We do have time for maybe a couple of questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
I saw interesting on your slide with the Wisconsin DNR. I am from Wisconsin, and I was one of the first people to jump on the bandwagon and start grazing
Mm-hmm.
the DNR land, and it's very similar to the BLM from out west.
Mm-hmm.
It does work, and DNR is short-staffed and
Yep.
need farmers to manage the land for it, so it does work.
Yeah, and that's a great point you bring up. And I think the two things I want to emphasize is, one, they are incredibly short-staffed. So one example, one of the refuges that we work with, 50,000 acre refuge. Guess how many people they have to manage a 50,000 acre refuge? One. That's right. It's impossible. So we're relying on volunteers. And that's the opportunity and the challenge with, if we can get farmers to be a part of that solution, and we can monetize it so that they can be successful, and we can get the desired environmental benefits too. Absolutely. I agree 100%.
We have time for one more quick question.
Yeah. So that's a great question. How do we keep predators away from our goats? So I'll tell you, in our research, what we do is we have electric fence, and we have to move those electric fence in a rotational grazing framework, and that's why some of those costs are elevated too. Other people have used llamas that they've put in with there to protect them. We're using we also try to get larger goats, so the meat goats versus the milk goats, and even the larger breeds of the meat goats too. We've been really concerned about that. We haven't had any issues. Our goat grazing person we contract doesn't, but it is an issue we need to worry about. We don't have a lot of wolves where we are, but we have coyotes. That's a challenge too, and that's the main concern. One of the other concerns is goat health, because they actually have lots of problems with various insects and worms that I can't remember. So maybe Kat can tell me which ones they are too. So we have to rotationally graze them and make sure that they stay healthy too. So there's a lot of health impacts with the goats that we have to be aware of.
Let's thank Mark again
Thank you.
for his presentation. Thanks, Mark. Our next presenter, Dr. João Casson from Brazil, and his presentation is entitled "Weed Management Affects Pasture Productivity and Livestock Performance: A Tropical Perspective." Casson.
Thanks, Byron. Thank you the opportunity to be here to present some study that we done in Brazil. So I'd like to start my presentation showing some, giving an overview about the Brazil biome, that we have. We have around 6 biomes. One of them is we call Amazonia, another Pantanal, Pampa, Caatinga, Cerrado, and Mata Atlântica. So just to give an overview, in this region, Amazonia, we have about 23 million hectares of pasture planted, okay? In Pantanal is a very established area. We have a native savanna or native pasture. In Pampa is the same, a very established area, very small area. When you go to the Caatinga, we have about 17 million hectares planted for pasture. And the Cerrado is the largest area that we have for pasture, about 67 million hectares. And the Mata Atlântica, about 42 million hectares of pasture. So in total, in Brazil, today, we have 150 million hectares of pasture planted, okay? Regarding these 150 million hectares, only 20% of the areas is treated. Some treatment could be herbicide, could be mold, or could be both, mold and herbicide. And we have some studies showing that this area can increase in the 10 and 15 years. We can increase 20% of this area could be treated based on the study that we receive. So in 10 or 15 years, we're gonna have around 50% of the area that we can have some treatment, okay? Another information is regarding the breeds. 80% of our breeds is Nelore, and we have 20% of Angus and other breeds, but the most important breed that we have in Brazil is Nelore. Another important information as well is regarding the pasture species. We have 80% of our total area pasture is brachiaria. The second one is panicle, different species, and some cynodon and other species. But the majority, the predominant is brachiaria. Some important information as well regarding the evolution of this area, regarding the evolution of the heads of the cattle in Brazil. So from 2007 to 2021, we reduced the area from 106 to 150 million, and in the same time, we grow in number of the head by hectare. So that shows us that we have more improvement and more efficient management for the pasture in Brazil. Another important information as well is regarding the area. So we can see that we have a decrease in area that we have classified as severe degradation. in the moderate degradation as well, and we are increasing the area that we have no degradation. So the study that we conduct in Brazil is to prove or to evaluate the efficacy of the herbicide to control two different species, weed species. One of them we call Urena lobata, another one is Voltaria americana, and the Brachiaria brisante. And we did a correlation of this control with the grass productivity. I don't want to read all this, but we have 5 trials in 2 years. Is an experiment. The plot is 5 by 10 with 4 replication. Application was done by backpack. The assessment is visual, and we did a kind of harvest the pasture, and we measured the biomass using a methodology developed by the São Paulo University in Brazil. And we did the correlation between the biomass and the animal unit per area using the same methodology. So we test two herbicides, Jaguar, that's a product that we use to apply for these weeds, and a new formulation of Jaguar Ultra that's more concentrate. Is the same active, but more concentrate. Jaguar, we have aminopyralide 40 grams per liter and plus 2,4-D 320. And the Jaguar Ultra, we have 50 plus 400. And we use Tordon as a standard, picolamp plus 2,4-D, okay? And all the application was done in post-emergency. Jaguar, we test 0.80 up to 1.5. Jaguar Ultra 0.64 to 1.2, Tordon 2 liters. This is a classic, let's say, is a traditional graph that we use to measure the weed competition. We don't have too many this study in Brazil, but I found one of this study. Sorry, it's in Portuguese, but here we can see the time. The after application, so here's 63 days after emergency, and here we have the grass productivity. So this line is represent the weed competition, okay, no control, and this dot line we can see when you have a control. We can see the increase of the productivity. So here's the time around 70 or 8 to 90 days after the weed competition, the grass start to lose productivity. So this, as we classify, we create a kind of a segmentation based on the weed species, okay? We have a segment that we call annual species, and have another segment we call biannual or herbaceous. That's the weeds that we test, we study. And then here we have some other weed species that we call semi-wood, wood, and palm as well. So from the left to the right, we classify the difficult to control. So in this segment is easy to control. When you go in this segment, we can say that is difficult to control. So this first graph, we can see the crop response or injury for the Brachiaria brisante. The bar is not reflecting, but we have just less than 40% of the crop injury, almost nothing for the herbicide. Is very selective for all formulation and rate, so we don't have any problem with the crop response. When you go to the weed control for Urena lobata, we can see that you have A little dose response for Jaguar, the same for Jaguar Ultra, and the rate that we gonna recommend will be Jaguar 1.5, that will be close to 90%, and Jaguar Ultra around 1.2 is the same control. For Volteria, is the same. You have a better control. We can see that a little dose response, but we can see that the product, regardless the formulation or the dose, you can see control close to or higher than 90% control for the Volteria americana. For the biomass, we can measure the untreated about 20 tons or 20,000 kilos, the untreated, and for all treatment, we can see the very good correlation between weed control and biomass production. So we increase the biomass from just to have the control of the weeds. This is a correlation of the biomass productive and the number of head that we can increment in the area. So in the untreated, we can see that we have just 1.1, okay, the treatment that we have no herbicide, and the weed is competing with the grass. When we have the treatment, we can see that we improve from 1.1 to 1.5, around the 1.5, or I mean 50% of the incremental of the number of the head by hectare, just controlling the weeds. Just a picture about the trial. We can see that this is the 0, or the day that we did the application. We have a very high infestation of weeds. 15 days, we can see some weeds dying in the plots. And the 30 days, we can see complete control that we have a high biomass production. We measure this productivity, so we collect the sample on the untreated plot. You collect the weeds and collect the grass. Compared to the treated, we can see that we increment of 73% of biomass. So the conclusion: the weed competition can degrade the forage quality, reduce the livestock performance and carrying capacity, animal unit, decrease the property value. The management of the weed on pasture is still a big challenge and require knowledge of the characteristics of the weeds, such as life cycle, root system, dispersal, infestation, etc. The combination of the management techniques can provide better forage and livestock productivity. The rancher must consider the forage as a crop. As such, must manage the development with the focus on the soil fertility, graze management, and weed management to have the we call return of investment. The study showed that just control the weeds can significantly increase the forage biomass productivity, resulting in increased livestock carrying capacity. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Casson. We do have time for some questions for Casson. Any questions? If not, we have the previous speakers here as well. We can take a question or two as we've got, how many minutes do we have there? 4:15, so we've got 5 minutes or so till the start of the next session. Any questions for Casson?
Do I need to have buyers or seriously?
Well, we're recording, Scott, so we need, or we'll have him repeat the question.
Kasson, do you have any estimates of what I guess the increase in productivity was? So, you know, we talk about 1 to 1 when you remove weed pressure. Do you have a good feeling for that in these types of systems? How much forage are we losing when we allowed weed encroachment?
These studies show that we can increase around 50%. So I think that is a direct correlation that we can lose 50% of the biomass when we leave the weeds.
So yeah, Kassan, thank you. So how are you dealing? Do you have legume issues in your pastures or tropical pastures? And if so, how do you deal with that with the herbicide application?
We don't have it. Just in the south of Brazil. You mean legume is a clover? Yeah. Just in the south of Brazil, we have some legume, but it's a very established pasture. Basically, they don't use any herbicide there. In this area that I show you, Cerrado, Amazon, we don't have a legume. Just grass and weeds.
I'm jealous.
Sorry, we have a big problem, Mark, is grass on grass now. We have a Sporobolus, is a grass species that's invade the grass pasture, so it's a big problem in Brazil.
Kassan, any ideas or kind of perceptions do you have on the amount of carbon being stored below ground based on your above ground practices?
In fact, we have a study that we contracted with 2 universities in Brazil. They show that just controlling the weeds, we increase the carbon footprint. So it's a study that we are continue to doing every year. We have just 2 seasons. We need to continue these studies.
Any other questions? Kasson, I have one question for you. The pictures you showed with the day of application, 15, and then 30 days after. Yep,
This one?
that one right there. So that's a really rapid progression there from day 0 to day 15 in terms of the grass growth and so on. In the areas where there is no weed control, you know, what's the rancher seeing, and what's their mindset at that point? You know, they look at their neighbors. Are they making any decisions at that point to maybe do something, or are they content with, you know, average productivity maybe?
Yeah, it depends, Byron, because we have a lot of lands available, and sometimes the ranch just leave the weeds as they have, and they say that I don't need to control because we are raising the cattle so well, so I don't need. So it's a kind of mindset we need to change. Yeah, I forgot to mention that for this kind of weeds, we needed 2,4-D for sure, because 2,4-D show very fast how to control the weeds, and the rancher is very sensitive to how he visualizes the weed control.
All right, let's thank Kasson for his presentation. Thank you, Kasson. So we've been talking about controlling weeds, and the next presentation will really kind of drive the point home a little bit more about why this is important. And our next presenter, Dr. Kat Barr from the North Carolina Veterinary Diagnostic Lab, will talk to us about toxic plants in grassland and their impact on livestock. Thank you, Kat.
Kind of a switch because I'm used to talking to veterinarians, so I'm kind of out of my normal comfort zone here. So if I say something that doesn't make sense to you, stop me and we'll try it again. So in terms of toxic plants and their impact, toxic plants that grow in grasslands and their impact on animals that are grazing, we think in terms of integrated toxic plant management. About 20 years ago, there was a big IPM push, and so we sort of put together integrated toxic plant management. For each of the toxic plants, they all have different means that are the best to control them. And controlling them is not my specialty, but I have to say that because you guys do that kind of thing. So in terms of what I can do for toxic plants and helping our producers and our ranchers know what they're looking at is show them how to identify the toxic plants in their region, explain how the animals are going to act when they consume those plants in excess, and help them recognize problem areas in their pasture. Some plants like it where it's wet, some plants like it high and sandy, so that they can recognize areas on their land that are going to possibly have those plants, because some things won't grow there. And then they have to formulate management strategies to control and minimize their losses. They have to remember to move the animals before the pasture gets too short, so the grass population maintains its hold and we don't have an invasion of weeds. And then the other thing is that they have to remember to not have the animals on the pasture if they're treating it either with herbicide or fertilizer. And the reason for that is because as plants die, they change palatability, frequently becoming sweeter. And animals who would not have eaten that yesterday will eat it today if you sprayed it. The thing we always have to remember with toxic plants is it's always, with any toxin, it's going to be the dose that makes it poisonous. So they can eat a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of the other thing, and go back and have some more of that. But as long as they don't eat too much of any one thing, they're probably going to be able to handle a plant that are toxic with no problem, as long as there's plenty of other forage available. So that's what we have to remember, because otherwise toxic plants get scary. One of the plants that is really kind of bad, I worked in the Texas lab for 35 years, so a lot of my background comes from working in Texas, is Western world milkweed. The narrow-leaved milkweeds have a neurotoxin in them, rather than the broadleaf milkweeds have a cardiotoxin in them. And the broadleaves they don't eat, so if you drive past a pasture, you'll see broadleaved milkweeds growing in a place where the grass has been decimated. They just won't eat them. But this Western world milkweed is very narrow, as you can see. It's a verticillate milkweed, and so it blends in very well with grasses, and it actually gets harvested sometimes into areas of irrigated alfalfa. And so we can have animals that are forced on it. This will cause seizures in horses and cattle, and it'll kill them. And every year we would have cases where I would get rumen contents with Western world milkweed in it, and we know exactly what killed those animals. So that's one that's, it grows by rhizomatous spread, and it can have very dense stands, and so it can be very problematic. There are several other verticillate milkweeds, but this is the one that we have the most problem with. The others don't typically grow as robustly in stands. This is Amaranthus species, and there are a lot of them, and I couldn't tell you which one this is. It doesn't really matter. They all concentrate nitrate from the soil to a much greater extent than the surrounding plants. We've measured nitrate levels in pigweeds anywhere from 1% to 12% by weight. It only takes 1% to kill a ruminant, okay? It concentrates the nitrate, and then the rumen microbes do a number on it. They change the nitrate to nitrite, and the nitrite goes on to form proteins, but that's the slow step in the metabolism. So if it gets overwhelmed with extra nitrite, there's enough buildup to cross into the bloodstream. So nitrite binds hemoglobin more tightly than oxygen does, and so it prevents any pickup of oxygen from the lungs, and so no oxygen gets to the animal's tissues. They can die very quickly. So nitrate will kill them in an hour to 4 hours from the time that they consume it. So you'll see animals that are struggling to breathe. They'll stand with their neck spread out, trying to force air into the system, and then they'll kind of get ataxic and stumble around, and eventually they'll die. There is an antidote to nitrate poisoning or nitrite poisoning, but you have to catch the animals in the act, and within 4 hours you're not likely to catch them. So it's one of the few toxic plants that we actually have an antidote for. The sennas are known for having laxative properties, and that's for humans. Several of the sennas have myotoxins in them. They will cause massive liver damage. This is coffee senna, Senna occidentalis. The other one that causes a lot of trouble pretty much around the world is Senna obtusifolia. And it's a less robust looking plant, and they're more palatable when it's green. This one they usually don't eat when it's green, and the seeds are the most toxic part of the plant. So usually what happens with coffee senna is that you have a large stand of it, and it suddenly gets freeze damaged. And as soon as the frost hits those leaves, the stench goes away. So the animals are not distracted by the just odoriferousness of the plant, and they'll go and eat those seeds. With cattle, you end up with an alert downer. So that animal is just down. Her muscles won't support her anymore. She can't stand up. It's called coffee senna because there's a lot of myoglobin dumped into the urinary system, and so sometimes you'll see urine that looks like coffee. And that's basically the muscles coming apart. The toxins are not really well understood. They're called senocides, and pretty much they destroy the oxidative phosphorylation chain in the mitochondrial cristae. So you're trashing the energy system of those cells. And that's not a nice steak, but it ought to be. So that's what it does in these animals. Interestingly, in goats and chickens, it causes cardiac damage, and so you have death on overexertion at some time later down the line, like having a myocardial infarct and suddenly going to run on a treadmill and keeling over. So it's kind of a surprise in goats and chickens. What surprises me is that goats and chickens are in any way alike, but that's just different. This is beefsteak plant, or Perilla frutescens. It has volatile perilla ketones, and it will pretty much affect all mammals in the same way. They take in those perilla ketones, and the volatility of those causes a change in the pneumocytes in the alveoli. The type 1 pneumocytes are very, very thin so that they facilitate the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the alveoli. Those die off and are suddenly replaced by pneumocyte 2s, and those are thick. And so the oxygen and CO2 exchange is impeded, and the lung, rather than being kind of something that expands and contracts, can't really contract anymore because it's all thickened. And so you have suffocation and heavy breathing. It's called pulmonary adenomatosis because those little alveoli that were just sacs that could go like this are stuck open. They look more like glands than sacs of air. So that's how that one works. All around the world, we've got various nightshades. This is silverleaf. It was very prevalent in Texas. I haven't seen nearly as much of it in North Carolina. I see Carolina horse nettle there. The nightshades typically have glycoalkaloids of various kinds in them. These include the family of tomatoes and potatoes. So solanine, solazidine, chaconine, tomatine, all that whole series of glycoalkaloids. Typically cause gut irritation and some incoordination or ataxia, some central nervous depression in some cases. And it depends on what part of the plant they eat and what growth stage the plant is at, how toxic the plant is. And that's really going to go with most toxic plants. They're going to vary all over the place depending on the environment they're growing in, the nutrients there, the growth stage, time of day sometimes. But these can cause enough GI irritation and colic and depression that occasionally we have death of cattle and horses. Sheep and goats are less sensitive. So using goats to control this is not a bad idea. Here's a couple of other nightshades. So the potato weed, or Solanum dimidiatum, very similar looking to it is Solanum carolinensis, which is what we have in North Carolina, the eastern horse nettle. The tomato things are the biggest part, or the most toxic part. And so the seeds, finding the seeds of that stuff in rumen contents is very helpful. Buffalo burr, if you can see how spiny that is, I don't know. But that's the fruit of the buffalo burr instead of the tomato-looking thing. Is this burr, much more like a datura, which is a close relative. This one's more of a problem when they get baled into hay. And believe it or not, those big old plants get baled into hay sometimes and cause trouble. My least favorite toxic plants are the ones that carry pyrrolizidine alkaloids. And the reason is because those are really sneaky toxins. The plant is going to vary with how much it's producing and which one of the spectrum of like 109 different pyrrolizidine alkaloids are known. And they all have varying toxicities. They're all metabolized in the liver, and so the toxicity is restricted to the liver. But they cause a progressive, irreversible scarring and replacement of functional hepatocytes with fibrosis. So again, similarly to what we saw in the muscle, we see a lot of pallor here in this liver, and that's the fibrous tissue replacing the functional muscle tissue. And so this happens over a period of time. There's typically a delay of 6 weeks to a year from the time the animal eats a fatal dose of the pyrrolizidine alkaloid-containing plant and the time that it dies. And it'll go along fine for a while, and then it'll experience a progressive weight loss and depression, just head hanging down, kind of a depressed posture, won't associate with others in the herd. They frequently have an aimless walking around, and then eventually they'll get to head pressing. When liver function disappears in the body, you stop metabolizing waste properly, and so ammonia builds up in the blood system and affects the brain by way of depression, and so it's essentially poisoning itself. So in the end, we have head pressing because they have a headache. They may have convulsions or go into a coma before they die. But like I said, it's very sneaky. It's progressive. And one of the most prolific grassland plants that we have is as an example, is Riddle's groundsel, Senecio riddlei. It's a perennial. It blooms in the fall. These are most toxic when they're flowering, but they have a long bloom period compared to some of the annual Senecios or Pacaras. So these leaves are hairless and they have composite flowers, and they, so they're fluffy, and you can see how prolific they can be out in the grassland and the prairie. So they can cause big problems that way. So how do we know that animals get poisoned by plants? How can we prove that? Well, here's how we do it. So when we have an animal die out in the pasture, veterinarian will go out there, take it apart, send us pieces and pits to the lab, and we'll do histopathology like they would on a person. We might look at their stomach content and see what they ate. That's my job. So I'm the rumen content queen. Come on, video. No. Go back. Why won't my video run? There we go. Okay, so I use these graded pans. You stack with the smallest screen on the bottom and the biggest one on top. And then you take a sample of rumen contents. That's really kind of small. They had a whole cow. They could have given me a quart, which is what I want, but they didn't. You wash it. I know, so stingy. You wash it through with water to get all the miscellaneous garbage out. And then you look at what's in those pans. The top pan is going to be the stuff they ate most recently because it's the biggest pieces. And if you think about it, cows ruminate, which means they re-chew everything. So it gets smaller and smaller over time. So if something killed them really fast, it'll be in the top pan. What's really important is the stuff in the bottom pan, the fines, the things that have been there for a while. So I take those out and I put them under the scope and try to identify fragments that came from toxic plants. And there are a few references that we use, but there's really not a whole lot available. So that's one of the things I'm working on, is putting together an atlas of the cellular patterns and trichomes from the toxic plants, so that the other veterinary toxicologists can use that as a resource, and maybe some wildlife people. So next, just go here. Okay, so this is, for example, the trichomes from Lantana camara, which is also toxic. It's a hepatotoxin. It causes a secondary photosensitivity in any animal that eats it, pretty much. But these trichomes have a really nice bulbous base on them. This basal cell pattern is very distinct. And I've taken some other photos of this plant, and the cellular pattern in between is also very distinct, but it doesn't show up in this photo. So secondary photosensitization is going to be produced by the damage to the liver by the lantana toxins, and then the animal gets sunburned. So they end up with sunburn on any lightly haired and white-haired areas. So if you think of a longhorn cow, they have a speckled back with, white and brown, and the white spots, they might be peeling that skin. They can have full thickness skin burns from this, besides the liver damage that happens. I also had a case where a puppy went and chewed the plant in the backyard and got enough of a dose of the lanthanins to kill the puppy with liver damage. This is Senna romeriana, or twin leaf senna. This grows in the Texas Hill Country in the calcareous soils. And it causes that muscle damage that we saw earlier that was caused by coffee senna. And it has a very distinctive trichome this kind of looks like the running of the bulls to me. It kind of, I'm thinking Pamplona. But the hairs are frequently opposite each other, and they have this speckly appearance to them that's very unique. So we can find that. And then, I talked about the berries being one of the most toxic parts on the nightshade. This is the seed coat of a berry from Solanum elenifolium, or silverleaf nightshade. So those are some of the telltale signs that we can see if we go through the rumen contents and figure out what the heck they've been eating that might have killed them. Now, most of the time it's going to be, malvas or clovers and things like that, and it's not part of the problem. But this is the fun part for me, so I'm weird. So that's me, and just so you have a little spice with your grass, just something a little bit different. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
So in the past few years, I've seen more and more producers have been on panels with people that are advocates for teaching animals to graze broadleaf weeds and brush. And I feel the same way about it. And I get, I try to tell them, I'm like, hey, there's a lot of toxic plants out there. Mm-hmm. And the rebuttal I get is, well, cattle self-medicate. They can go out and they graze a
cows are stupid.
And I always come back and say, I've never seen a pharmacy in the pasture, so I don't know how they're self-medicating.
Well, but it is a pharmacy in the pasture, and actually that's how I got into this business, because I went through a witchcraft phase in junior high, and the herbal medicine stuck. And I was interviewing for a job in a toxicology lab, and the guy was on the phone, and he had all these dead plants up here on the bench in a chemistry lab. It's like, wait a minute, I know who those are. And it hadn't dawned on me that what's medicine is also poison. That goes back to the Paracelsus thing, where it's the dose that makes the poison. And so, like I said, if you don't have a monoculture of one bad thing, you can probably get away with it. But if you've got a huge patch of one bad thing and they get into that patch, there's a problem. So
I think we have time for one other question. John?
Are you seeing an influx of poisoning from giant hemlock that's creeping into hayfields and pastures from highway and interstate right-of-ways? We are in Virginia.
Okay, I have not seen it yet, but North Carolina doesn't yet know that I exist because I just moved to their lab. So I would really like to be in touch with the Virginia lab. If somebody there is seeing it, I would love to be able to make those contacts because I'm sure we've got it. It's escaped all over the place. Good question, thank you. Thank y'all for your attention.
Let's thank Kat again. After seeing Kat's presentation, I think I'm gonna walk everywhere I can and pull a weed or something like that, Kat. That's our next presentation will be from Dr. Scott Flynn, and his presentation today: forage response and economic benefits to weed management in grasslands. Scott.
So I can guarantee you I'm not going to be as interesting as our last speaker. And just so you know, I'm not an economist, but I've been married for 19 years, and I've got 2 kids, and so I'll know all about losing money. So I want to talk about forage response, the economic benefits of weed control. And when I first started with Corteva in 2011, one of the things that kept recurring was, well, when is a good time to start spraying weeds? What's that economic threshold? And weed scientists have come up with this for row crops, and they kind of know that, you know, at this point, this is when we need to go out and make an application because we start losing yield. Don't really have anything like that for pastures. But if we stop and think about pastures and we start thinking about beef production systems, if I were to ask a producer, what's the price per pound of beef? They could probably tell me right away. But when you start asking questions like this, so how many pounds of beef do you produce per acre? What's the break-even price for that pound of beef? If you go through a lot of these, they're going to stop in their tracks. They cannot answer it. You go to a row crop person, and they're going to tell you what is the break-even price on that bushel of corn. What are that soil requirements? We don't have that interest or that depth of knowledge in range and pasture to answer a lot of these questions. So started working on tools that would help us kind of get at these break-even costs or when it's time to go in and make an application for herbicide. Now, one thing I'd like to point out is that if we look at, and these numbers are a couple of years old, I know prices have gone up, but if we were to look at a hay feeding scenario, it would cost us somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.40 to $1.75 per head per day to feed that animal hay. All right? If we look at a pasture being grazed, that's about 45 to 65 cents. So the difference there is $1 per head per day. So for every day that an animal is not being fed hay, not being fed that stored feed, we're saving at least $1. So this kind of comes one of the basis when we're talking about weed pressure, because weeds are taking away that grazable area in that pasture. In some cases, our folks are starting to feed hay earlier in the year because they don't have the forage production, or during high stress times, they're having to supplement those animals. So by far, grazing that pasture is by far the cheapest. Now this is Mark's former graduate student. He was an intern for me years ago. This is Garrett Imhoff. And Garrett, I had him helping me out with this project in southern Missouri. Now, do you see all the weeds in this pasture? The thistles. This guy did not spray because he had clover. So there was a lot of benefit here, as you can see. We went in and made an application of a new herbicide that hopefully we'll have in the next year or so called Proclova, and you can see the difference. This is right across the hot wire fence that we split these pastures in. So huge difference in weed pressure and forage production between these two systems. But one of the things we took out of that were the differences in production and utilization. So for instance, if we look at total forage production, where we had sprayed this clover safe herbicide, we had 8,344 pounds of dry matter per acre. And I'm sorry I added this in this morning and did not convert it over to kilograms per hectare. Byron, I'll buy you a beer later, buddy. On the untreated side, it was 68.82 on the untreated. So the difference is we increased forage production on that by 1,462 pounds. Now, we were using this clover concept, and we see that the clover, we had 104 pounds of dry matter in the clover safe side, and 458 on the other side. Now, what's interesting is look at forage utilization. They were grazing the clover treated pasture, call it Proclova. They were grazing it much harder. And so the utilization in this pasture was 61%, where we were utilizing about 37% in the untreated pasture. A couple of other numbers here. Look at the total forage consumed from the treated and the untreated side. Look at the total number of broadleaves consumed. So we were consuming about 900 pounds, and that was primarily spiny pigweed. They were eating the tops out of spiny pigweed. And I think that accounted for a lot of it. But when we looked at the end of the season, when we got down to the end of the season, see, where's mine? Yeah, this 1,462 pounds gave us a few more days of grazing. We cut about 2 weeks off from hay feeding in this operation, just in this simple study. Broadleaf weeds, you'll see we had 85 pounds of broadleaf weeds. We didn't control them all, controlled about 90% of them. We're in the untreated. At the end of season, we had 890. So more than 1.5, almost 2 pounds of gain for every pound of weeds we actually controlled in that field. Now, if we look at the work that's been done over the years, and a lot of this has been in the southern U.S. and warm season grasses, and we look at the forage response, on average, it's about 1.5. We get about a 1 to 1.5 response for every pound of weeds we control. And that comes from several different sources. You have perennial weeds that stand there all year, they shade out. In other cases, it may be that those animals are avoiding certain areas and they're just not consuming that forage. But when we look at what that forage response is, it's about 1 to 1.5. So for every pound of weeds control, we get about 1.5 pounds of forage. In some cases, with some weeds, it can be significant. The other thing we have to take into consideration when we're talking about economics for weed control, so we've discussed that, or we've established that there's about 1.5 pounds advantage for every pound of weeds we have controlled. But some species, they create these grazing zones or these no grazing zones around these grazing avoidance. And bull thistle here in the United States in particular is one that creates more of a zone than others because of this little spine that sticks out on the end. And the cattle's nose, it's really soft, it's tender, and so they don't want to get up around that. And so we see this zone of influence around bull thistle in particular, where they don't want to graze it. And this study was published. This was 2005, where they talk about these different zones around musk and bull thistle, and they talk about the reduction in forage utilization because of these no-go zones, these zones of avoidance around these species. So when we look at the loss of forage, we've established that we have a forage production loss just from resource competition. The grazing avoidance loss is something that's a little more difficult to understand, and so I'm going to leave that out for now. But that gives us this weed effect. So the loss in production, what areas are they actually avoiding, that gives us that weed effect. For now, we're going to play around with these numbers because I just don't really have a good grasp on how to estimate that. So let's look at some assumptions here. So if we look at forage production, and depending on where you're at in the United States, it can be anywhere from 2 metric tons to 12 metric tons per acre in these high rainfall areas. If we look at the weed effect, it's going to be somewhere between 1.1 and 1.5 that's going to get displaced. Seasonal utilization, this is one that a lot of people don't take into account, but a continuously grazed operation does a much poorer job of utilizing forage than a strip grazing. And then rotational grazing is probably somewhere right there. Traditional rotational grazing is somewhere right there in the middle. Feed efficacy, anywhere from 7 to 10 kilograms of dry matter to maintain or to put on a kilogram of body weight on a beef. And in some cases, if it's really poor quality forage, that might be 15, all right? And then herbicide cost per acre, you know, what is that application cost that goes into to cleaning up those weeds? And then years between applications. So I started developing a model a few years ago based on these numbers. And if you're willing to make some estimates on what your production is, what level of control you can get, what type of grazing operation, you can work out what is that economic threshold, or what is that benefit to you for controlling broadleaf weeds. So let's look at a continuous grazing system, all right? So this is probably typical for the Midwest, where we're getting 45 inches of rainfall a year. But forage production, somewhere around 6,000 kilograms of dry matter per hectare. Weed pressure, this is at 20% weed pressure. It's about 1,500 kilograms of dry matter per hectare. If we look at the weed effect and we're going to say, hey, you know, based on data, we know it's going to be about 1.5 pounds. Forage utilization, again, it's continuously grazed, so we're going to use about 30% of that forage. Stocking rate, let's estimate 750 kilograms of body weight per hectare. And then dry matter intake, somewhere around 2.6% of body weight, and this is assuming mature cow. So what is the potential increase in forage production? Well, if we're displacing 1.5 kilograms of dry matter per hectare for every kilogram of weed pressure, and we multiply that by this 1,500 kilograms of dry matter of weed pressure that we're going to control, so this is assuming we control it, the return on that is 2,250 kilograms of dry matter per hectare, all right? So if we go in, we implement that good weed control program, this is what we should get over the season, increase in production. So what about the potential increase in dry matter utilization? Well, if we're only using 30% of that, then what we're actually getting in that animal, the true benefit to that animal is 675 kilograms of dry matter per hectare. So what does that mean? Well, if we're consuming 2.6% of our animal's body weight, and this is the amount of dry matter we have available, what that does is adds 37.5 days of grazing onto that operation. All right? So by producing more forage, we have the ability to extend our grazing season, or we can increase the pounds of dry matter, or pounds of body weight per acre. And that's where we go back and pull in those numbers. You know, if it's 50, 60 cents per head per day, then we can work, let's say it's 50 cents per head per day. And right now you're looking at, you can afford to spend, well, let's say if it's $1 per head per day, you're saving yourself $37 by going in and controlling weeds, because that's what's going to offset in terms of stored feed. Now, what about a rotational grazing system? So again, if we make some assumptions here, we're going to assume 10% total herbage, weed mass in that field, because most of the time rotational grazing systems do a better job of suppressing those broadleaf weeds and keeping them at a much lower threshold. So in this case, let's assume 10%. The weed effect will keep it the same at 1.5 to 1. Forage utilization, because we're assuming rotational grazing, we've got much better utilization. Keep the stocking rate the same and the dry matter intake. Now, The potential increase in forage production, again, it's much less. But we go through here 1.5 times the 675 kilograms of dry matter of weed pressure we're going to remove. Just a little over 1,000 kilograms of dry matter per hectare. So potential increase in dry matter utilization if we're utilizing 50% of rotational grazing system, that means we're going to have a little over 500 kilograms of dry matter per hectare. The benefit is right around 28 days. So with half the weed pressure in a rotational grazing system, we're still at right around that same value of 20, 30 days in that general area. So we start looking at the economics of weed control. We have to take into account how much are we producing. Once we get control of the weed pressure in that field, what does it gain us? How well are the animals going to utilize what we have in there? And what does that mean in terms of extending the grazing season or increasing that stocking rate? So, what to consider? You need to consider the cost of application of the herbicide. If you're saving yourself $1 per day by not feeding a supplementing hay, if you look at the cost of a herbicide, maybe $25 an acre with application fees, adjuvants, and all that. Yeah, if you can add 25 days or more on to that operation, you can pay for that cost of herbicide. You need to also understand what level of utilization you have out there. The forage quality, so in terms of animal response, is it going to take 7 pounds for every pound of body weight here, or is it going to take 15? The current market conditions, if cattle are your profits a penny per pound, it really makes it's hard to make sense out of making any application in that situation. And the other thing is, what are you going to do with that extra forage? Is it going to extend your grazing season, like we use it for in cool season grass pastures, or are we going to use that to bump up and have a few more pounds of animal weight per acre? So with that, I'll take any questions. Thanks, Scott.
We need to record for the session here.
I just have a question on how you calculated the weed effect and whether that data that you took to calculate the ratio that you had up there was localized, or can it be generalized to use in any context?
It was averaged over a lot of studies that were conducted. I think there were about 25 studies in that. And then in research that Corteva has done, we've kind of verified that, somewhere in that range of a pound, pound and a half. With different weeds, I think there are different thresholds. You have some that offset much more than others, but when you have them in a mix, I think you still tend to drift towards that, that anywhere from 1 to 1.5 pounds seems to be kind of a safe bet. It seems to only get worse as the weed species get worse.
I have a question. You were mentioning about the gentleman that didn't want to spray for clover. So from Florida, we have an instance of tropical soda apples. So they create kind of a barrier zone where those cattle aren't going to graze around the TSA. What did you look at the cost of if they were to spray with herbicide and then reseed, what that cost would be in a savings in that weed effect? Does that make sense?
So if you were to respray,
where he's avoiding spraying because of that, wanting to maintain clover, what it would have been.
No, I haven't looked at that.
Scott, I'm curious, in any of your calculations, do you factor in the longevity of that seed bed and what benefits play out in more of a long-term approach, say 15, 20 years for some of these seeds that can live for a lot longer than just the current year?
In an indirect way, I try to account for it. So I say that, most operations, we want to get at least 2 years between applications before we need to make that make that choice. So if we're applying every year to maintain that, you know, those that really makes this model a lot harder to, you know, convince somebody to, hey, go out and use herbicide unless you're using something really cheap. But a lot of times I'm assuming at least we're going to get 2 years between applications before that population gets back to the point where we're going to make an application.
All right, let's thank Scott for his presentation. Our next presenter is Dr. Jose Debu from the University of Florida. And the title of his presentation is Weed Management Affects Pasture Productivity and Livestock Performance. In this case, our subtropical view of this presentation. Thanks, Jose.
Thanks, Byron. Thanks for the invitation to be part of this session. I'd like to start asking, how many of you have drilled spiny pigweed on Bermuda grass pastures? No takers? We did. We're going to tell a little bit of that story today. And I can tell that was not a very popular project with my farm manager, but we did anyway. Yes, weed encroachment, as we saw already in this session, it does results in competition with the main forage. It competes for water, for nutrients, and overall, we expect that to reduce forage productivity. That number that Scott mentioned, it makes a lot of sense to me, especially if you're replacing a C4 grass by a C3 weed in terms of water use. If water is an issue, you know, weeds take, you know, a lot of water, and that can reduce a lot of your C4 grass productivity. Besides that, weeds, they result in damage for, you know, it can hurt the animals, depreciate the land value, and brings a lot of different economic losses to livestock operations. So that's a simulation that I did using some of that data, and my numbers are very similar to Scott's numbers in terms of replacing you know, the C4 grass by the C3 weed. But as you increase the encroachment of weeds, we expect, well, your C4 grass is going to reduce and your C3 weed is going to increase in terms of infestation, and that will reduce stocking rate. So it just makes sense. If you pull apart the different components of animal production per hectare, you end up with these complex things, but we expect weed encroachment to affect different of those things. For example, we expect weed encroachment to reduce the forage production per area because it's competing, as it's been shown today. But we also expect the weed to reduce forage nutritive value, and that also affect voluntary intake. And those are components that can affect how much forage is going to be consumed per hectare, and that's one of the biggest points in terms of animal production per hectare. So we're going to have less animals per hectare. You also expect lower output per each animal, lower average daily gain, and at the end, we do expect that weed encroachment could reduce animal product per hectare. There are some examples in the literature showing that, you know, in this case, it comes from Texas, mesquite cover, which is an arboreal weed, right, in the case of Texas, and it does reduce a lot the total herbaceous biomass, and mainly because of competition for water, lights, and nutrients. One of the things that I would like to highlight is that grazing management can help you to reduce a little bit the weed problem, because if you don't graze to the ground like your left side, and you're more towards the right side, you can you know, reduce the opportunity for those weeds to germinate and to thrive in that environment. But once they germinate, yes, you need to control because they typically are more adapted to that particular environment than your grass that you're trying to use. And that's some of the data down from Brazil, where they use different sward heights here, 10, 20, 30, 40 centimeters. So he was more lenient grazing. He's more, kind of overgrazing situation, and you have a much, bigger number of winter weeds, and at the end, more, summer weeds, and also weed seed the seed bank was much bigger here in this situation. So that tells that the grazing management can help you, but not grazing to the ground and be like more lenient towards the lenient side of the grazing. You can prevent the weeds to come. But again, once they are established, they might be controlled. They must be controlled because they are more adapted. They have a big seed bank, and they are weeds because the animals don't eat them. So they have a competitive advantage on that. So now I'm going to tell the story about drilling the spiny pigweed on Bermuda grass. So we did control, one of the stories that on the left here is we used Duracore to control the spiny pigweed, and the other side we didn't. And we drilled some of the pigweed on those pastures to make sure we had. Our goal was to create a range of weed encroachment in that pasture. So not sure if you can see here well, but that's the clean pasture. And then you had the other side, the dirty one, which full of spiny pigweed all over the place. And then we create strips of pigweeds, and then we apply herbicide in some of the alternate strips of Bermuda grass. We didn't bring anything new to Florida, to Mariana. We collected our own spiny pigweed so that we are not, creating problems. And I did that because of a great group of students. We went, in November, we went out there and collect a bunch of pigweeds, and we kind of dried them and collect the seeds. I had no idea, how much it should be my seeding rate, but because I need to plant 30 acres and I had 30 pounds of seed, that was an easy decision. 1 pound per acre, that's my rate. And I can tell that we are pretty successful. You can see the pictures there on the pigweed side, right? Well, some of the surprise, that's the Bermuda grass herbage mass. Although we had a lot of pigweed, there was also Bermuda grass in between the pigweeds, and we also assessed that, and that was not very different across treatment. So we had just a date, evaluation date effect. But yes, there was, as expected, much more pigweed in the dirty than in the strip treatments. In terms of forage nutritive value, we didn't have any effect on the Bermuda grass nutritive value, but I did see some cows grazing the tops of the pigweed as well, Scott, and we did that. And so pigweed has a pretty good crude protein, and digestibility is not that great, around the 50s. But anyhow, we did see some of the cows eating that. But one thing that I want to make sure that I bring that up is that because you're not in the dirty treatment, the strip treatments, we're not spraying with anything, we had serious problems with other weeds that were not spiny pigweed. In the first year, we had coffee senna occidentalis, that is poison to cattle, and we actually had problems with cattle. We lost some cattle because of that. So it's not only about the spiny pigweed, but also the other weeds that can show up. I have some pretty interesting data here to show we put some GPS collars on the neck of the cows, and that create big data. Igor Bretas at the back of the room, he helped me to make sense out of this mess. I never had a problem to run out of rows in the Excel. I didn't even know how many rows the Excel file has, but in this project, I found that Excel has only 1.7 million rows, and we run out of those rows because that collar was logging every second for 21-day period the location of the cow, and that gives a precision of 1 meter where they were, because we wanted to know if they were more on the strips, on the grass. So that gave me big data, and to be honest, Igor saved my life because I had no idea how to deal with this mess. And pretty interesting result. Here we did have some differences in terms of how much the cows traveled. For example, there was they walked much more in the dirty compared to the clean, because they had to go over and beyond their job duty to find the grass that they had to graze and make sure that they're going to have the right intake for the day. So that's one of the things that we found, that the ones in the dirty, they walked much more than the ones in the clean treatment. They also walked faster. That's the rate of travel in meters per minute. So they walked much faster than the ones that they had, grass available for them. So that's pretty interesting data. So that's another interesting heat map, where we kind of try to find out where those were. So if you see here in the dirty, so those red spots or hits here means that's where the cows were most of the time. They're, as you get more red here, that means that they spent more time. So you see that at the beginning they spent more time around, the edges of the paddocks. They were not really going inside the paddock because there was, a whole lot of pigweed there that was, even hard to walk. But as you get towards the end of the season, the pigweed was kind of dying and getting brittle, so it was easier for them and get grass that was available there. So that's really interesting story. And the clean had like a more evenly distribution of the grazing across the paddock, and that helps with the nutrient distribution. That's pretty there. So, help it to make sense out of this. This is the that the spent on the Bermuda strip and pigweed strip, and of course, yeah, they spent more time on the Bermuda strip because Bermuda has no spines, huh? And so they like that one better. But it's interesting because we are able to, with the GP, quantify that into number. Again, the voluntary intake, if you pull apart the different components of voluntary intake, that's what you get. You get, bites per day, this big equation, bites per day and bite weight. You can, dividing those things up. Here is bites per day. It's pretty much bites per minute or bite rate and the grazing time, how much time they spend grazing. So sometimes if they don't have enough forage, they just, extend the grazing time. That's one of strategy. And bite weight is a function of the bite volume and the canopy book density on those units here. And bite volume is bite depth and bite area. So we're expecting, because of all this pigweed and the strategy the cow has to, to select the upper hand forage, would affect the intake as well. But anyhow, the truth is that we didn't have differences in terms of average daily gain. We didn't, that's the average daily gain on the clean, the strip, and the dirty. And that's the gain per area. So we're going to go to the third year of this project. And perhaps one of the things that I might change in the third year is that here we had an herbage allowance of around 2.2. That means that we didn't push a whole lot, the stocking rate, because one of the things that we are concerned of the other, poisonous weed, the coffee sand and things like that, we're concerned, even though we had issues with those things. But I think we're going to push a little more in the third year and see if we get some interesting different or not. But that's the story of the first 2 years. And another thing that came out of this project, and again, Igor is helping, is we did some drone flights with a multispectral camera, and we're able to work together with some folks in Gainesville as well to develop a site-specific weed management based on remote sensing and artificial intelligences. Basically, we kind of validate images. Igor kind of, did some contour around the pigweeds and teach the computer how to understand that, and then This map here on the right, this was generated by the artificial neural network based on the images and the computer how to read where the pigweeds are. So you see the computer did a pretty good job on the strips, on the dirty, and on the clean side with very good predictive accuracy. So to finalize here, weed encroachment did affect livestock behavior. It didn't affect performance in our case, but we think that that there is probably a good chance to affect as we increase our the time of our work. Grazing management might reduce weed encroachment as a preventive tactic, but once weeds are established, we need to control them. And the site-specific weed management is a promised strategy for weed control. And yes, weeds reduce livestock output per area by affecting forage productivity, forage utilization, forage nutritive value, and potentially intake. So I want to thank Cortiva for funding this study. We've been learning a lot as well. I never drilled pigweed before, but so we've been learning with this project, and it's been quite interesting to learn those things. Thank you very much.
Any questions for Jose?
Did you happen to run nitrate on the pigweed to know how high it was, and were the animals eating it or avoiding it?
We did not run nitrates, but we just did crude protein and digestibility. But we still have the samples, so that's something that we could potentially do. Yeah. But we had some movies I didn't put today, but we did have some movies of them eating the pigweed. Yeah.
I guess in terms of performance, you commented about you did not see any differences. Why do you think that you saw those types of results?
Right. My hypothesis is that maybe because there is enough Bermuda grass that was enough, so we're gonna push a little more the stocking rate this year and see if we have some different results. The average allowance around 2, which is not crazy high, but it's more on the high side. So we're gonna try to put more in. We did that to avoid problems with the animals, but we're gonna push that, and we just be more careful with the poison weeds. I had to go with a group of students to pull up those poison weeds by hand because we couldn't spray anything because that was part of our treatment. So we did that in the second year, and we didn't have problems. So we keep an eye on that, and we try to move that into that direction. No, I mean, the reduction in herbicide would be possible if you use this model. I mean, we are far from there, but we are trying to build a model where, you can spray just the spots that you have pigweeds in the pasture, and if you do that, then you can reduce a lot the amount of herbicide that you can. Not there yet.
Jose, just a quick question on your spines. We have other spiny weeds where I come from. Do you have any diseases associated? So we often find a disease called orth, which will transmit to the needle, and then the needle transmits it amongst the rest of the flock. Do you do have some?
Right. In this study, I didn't see that, but like I said, in the first seaway, we lost a couple of animals, but I don't think it was the pigweed. The problem was the coffee senna that was also part of the botanical composition in that particular paddock.
Any other questions for Jose? Jose, I'd like to say, you said you were not a favorite because you planted pigweed there. My PhD research, I was looking at amaranthus species as potential forage crops, and I actually planted a bunch of them in an area in the country where these are major weeds in crops. I didn't win any awards for doing that, and 20 plus years after, I go back to that farm, and I'm still looked at with, let's just say, disdain when they realized I was the one that planted some of those amaranthus there.
Yeah.
So
And I can tell that it was not a very popular project among my graduate students as well. Because, you know, the summer in Florida is hot and humid, and it's not fun to go in that big weed, you know.
let's thank Jose again for his presentation.